Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Friday Happy Hour webcast from WhiskyCast.com. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast studio in New Jersey, and we're back after the holidays. Hope your holiday and festive season was a good one and that you and yours were able to stay safe and avoid the pandemic and other things that have happened over the last few days. I will admit that I have had a hard time the last day or so trying to think about how I was going to, or whether I should even refer to the events of Wednesday on this webcast. There was part of me that had wondered whether we should even do it right now, because it just, with what's going on in the world right now, part of me wonders whether it's appropriate to have happy talk about whiskey. But we're going to go ahead because that is what we do, and we need a distraction. I'm not going to get into the events of Wednesday other than to say that I am completely and utterly angry, frustrated, and yes, ashamed of what happened Wednesday in Washington. And I will leave it at that and hope that better times are ahead and that nothing like this ever happens again. As always, we welcome your comments and questions over the next hour or so. You can comment via the chat links in YouTube and on our Facebook page, and we'll be glad to share some of your comments. We'd love to find out what you're drinking tonight as well. Feel free to share that with us. I'll run through just a few of the comments. We have missed you guys over the last couple of weeks, with Friday being Christmas and New Year's the last 2 weekends. It just didn't seem right to do the show, but we're going to run through some folks here. Some of your comments from Graham Fraser. Happy New Year, Mark and Barflies. Graham, Happy New Year to you as well. Same to you, Matt. Pete Head, Nurse Dave's Shaving World. Glad the happy hour is back. So are we. I've been looking forward to this, with the exception of what I had just mentioned, for a few days right now. Gary in Tasmania, where it's Saturday morning and the weekend is already in full swing. Good morning. Chris Ratcliffe, David Owen, Tim Foster, and as Chris points out, we need this now more than ever. Graham says, hopefully a better future, Mark. One good thing that happened, and Tom Fredericks points this out, congratulations on the U.S. World Juniors win. The U.S. won the World Junior Hockey Championship the other night, and I think we beat Canada. I got to admit, I wasn't watching, so I think we beat the Canadians, but I could be wrong about that. And Chris Ratcliffe, can people comment against the tweet? Of course, you can always comment. Omar Ganor, good evening from Tel Aviv. Spirit Bomb, Tabitha, hope everyone's okay today. Tor Christensen in Norway, good evening from Arctic Norway. And Mark Seagatz, good evening from Germany with some Lindores new make. Happy New Year. Perfect timing for that one, because our guests were joined right now by the folks from Lindores Abbey Distillery. On the top of the screen, Drew and Helen McKenzie Smith, the founders of Lindores Abbey. And down at the bottom of your screen, Gary Haggart, the distillery manager, joining us from his home about half an hour from the distillery. Drew and Helen, tell us where you're at tonight and what you're drinking.
We have the pleasure of being in the Legacy Bar at Lindores Abbey. Where we're sitting is about 20 feet away from the stills. And I suppose very appropriately, we're both drinking from the founder's dram. But technically it's not whiskey yet. It's 23 days away from being whiskey. It was the cask that I selected back in 2018, the one that sort of leapt out at me, which I'm super proud of. I regret making it so public because it's half empty now. Because when we're doing events, it's such a good dram for such a young dram that we tend to use it a lot, and I just see it going down and down and down. So by the time it's 10 years old, there'll be very little left. But so no, we're really privileged to have it. Still has the charcoal in it. It's from an STR red wine barrique. Which is a favorite of Jim Swan and Miguel Martin. It was something they created. It's their own recipe. We will not be the only distillery that has them. Jim Swan, as you know, had a few. But anyway, I'm privileged to have it, and I'm enjoying sharing it with you all virtually, if nothing else.
Sláinte. Helen, what do you have in your glass?
Well, I have the same, but I've got a little sideline of one of my wee favourites of a Lefroy as well. So yeah, I'm being a little bit cheeky because Drew's only given me a tiny measure of the Founder's Cask because there isn't very much left. Interestingly, it's the dram that we shared with the team on the day that we celebrated our third birthday, and we had a very socially distanced but very moving array of us in the warehouse, and Gary gave us all a little dram, and we all shared it together.
Yeah, it was a big day, just very recently.
Yeah, 20th of December. It's really recent.
And that's when your whiskey became 3 years old, Gary. How soon do we see it in a bottle?
That's a big question, isn't it, Mark? Hopefully not too far away. We're quietly confident that we're going to have a fantastic whiskey ready in 2021.
And I know the first cask goes to the members of your club, right? Or the first bottling.
That's correct, yes. The first bottling is going to the 1494, the Preservation Society.
And tell us about that society, guys. Who gets into it and how do you get in? If you still can, or can you still get in?
You can still get in. It's limited to 1,494 members, and then it's finished altogether. It's filling up quickly. It has been for the last kind of couple of years, but for obvious reasons, it's accelerating now. It was set up with my heart involved. It was set up. It's called the Preservation Society. Funds from it go towards preserving the abbey, to preserving what the monks did, etc. That's with my heart. With my head, I'm slightly, when I started this 20 plus years ago, I was maybe a wee bit more naive than I am now. And so I do realize, and I welcome them all, but I think people are also realizing that it's the only way of getting the first bottling from Lindores. We'll have our first public bottling, as Gary says, in 2021. But this is the only way of getting the very first one. So it's quite a special thing. There's all sorts of other things added to being a member. But I'd like to think it's the fact that people will benefit. They can build a collection of whiskey. But I genuinely like to think that more importantly, they are helping preserve 12th century abbey and what went on here all those years ago. So it's a double thing. It's an investment and it's a feel-good thing.
We're sitting in the legacy bar, and interestingly, the names that you can maybe slightly see behind us in the shelves, they're the names of all the members, and this is their legacy that goes to create the legacy bar. And when you become a 1494 member, one of the things that you have is your name carved up here on the shelves. So when you come and have a dram, you can pat yourself on the back and thank yourself for contributing to the upkeep of the abbey ruins and development of things like the still that we found and bring people along to have a look at that in the future too.
Rather foolishly, well, not foolishly. It's a great thing to have. That we're really aware that lots of people buy these things and it's a collector's item, etc., and they don't want to drink it, and I get that. So what we're saying to all the members is, well, look, when you come here, or if you physically can't come here, because even after COVID, it's a long way to come from around the world, that if you can come here, we'll share a dram. And I suddenly realized I'm offering to share a dram with nearly 1,500 people. So hopefully they'll come over a sort of 10-year period.
Yeah, because I know that Gary, when we met in Canada a couple of years ago, I think in Cornwall.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You offered, you gave out your business card and said, my business card's good for a free tour and a dram.
That's right. Yeah, it was like Willy Wonka's golden ticket. That's right. I told anyone that if they turned up at the distillery with my business card, I would give them a tour for free. That's right, and take them into the warehouse. As of yet, nobody's taken it up, but I've got a funny feeling I'll see a few people.
Oh, yeah, they're all waiting. And we did get a note here from Andrew Wedge. He and his rugby boys have a cask at the distillery, and they can't wait to try it. Do you have an update on their cask that you can give them, Andrew?
I think it's empty, Drew. No, joking.
You actually for it, right?
It's something that's really important to us, Mark, with the private cask members. It's been very beneficial to us for various reasons. One, we're we're able to generate whiskey enthusiasts through the cast, you know, and we're becoming people that are really passionate and strong about Lindores, that like what we're doing. We didn't give ourselves, but we created the role of the cask custodian. So they've got this a guy called Elliot Wynne Higgins, who they're able to have this one-on-one communication with. Sometimes they can't speak to me, but they'll always be available to speak to Elliot, and Elliot can then come and speak to myself. So we've got that really personal touch. We try and go that extra mile for the people, try and find them that perfect cask that they're looking for. But the beauty about it is, as well, is it allows ourselves at Lindores to fill other casks. So if somebody comes along asking for an unusual cask, ourselves at Lindores will go, yeah, you know, something, that's not a bad idea at all, and we'll fill into that cask as well. So it lets us see how the spirit's developing. But we've just recently emptied our warehouse, and we've put a big new racking system in so that we can keep every single individual private cask here on site, and I can keep a personal eye on it as well.
Are you keeping other casks off-site, though?
We are, yes. Our core range, they are still very local, but they aren't on site. But I know it's certainly myself and Drew's dream is to bring everything much closer to home. It breaks my heart when we load casks onto the back of the lorry and they drive away into the distance. I think any distillery manager, any time, wants to be able to go and have a look at their casks and just make sure everything's okay. I know they're getting well looked after, but there's still that niggle at the back head of what if that one's leaking, or what about this, you know. So it'll be nice to see them all come back home eventually.
How are you guys coping with the pandemic? We had a question from Chris Ratcliffe about wondering whether the travel restrictions helped or hindered you tourism-wise last year. I'm assuming it pretty much hindered you, and I know that there's a lockdown again in place. So how did that affect you? Because normally the distillery would have gotten, or at least the Abbey would have gotten, a lot of tourists, no matter whether the distillery was there or not.
Yeah.
Well, last year was the first year that we actually had, I suppose, you know, building up tourists over the period of time. Last year was the first year that we had over 650,000 people. Sorry, no, that's not quite true. No, sorry, 35,000 people booked in, pre-advance booked in. And obviously that fell off a cliff almost overnight. We've been really lucky because we're tiny and because we have a really good local community that we've been able to carry on operating once lockdown was eased a little bit. So we did lots and lots of events in the courtyard, and we were able to entertain people outside. We've done loads and loads of little micro weddings, which have been absolutely gorgeous. But on the sort of basis of whiskey visitors, no, it's been a horrid old year, because really, you know, fundamentally it's lovely to do all the other things, but we are first and foremost a whiskey distillery, and it's been a great shame to not be able to welcome those enthusiasts, especially as the excitement's building with our whiskey about to be, you know, proper whiskey, and it's been a sad time, but we've been very positive about it, actually. All the tour guides responded very well, and we managed to take great precautions, and we're very lucky because we have the Abbey as well as the actual distillery and the visitor centre. Gary and his team were very accommodating about sort of creating areas that we could bring visitors into without putting the distillery team at risk. So really, we feel we were able to be quite nimble about it, and it's not been a disastrous year at all for us, and yet we equally don't want to sound smug about it. You know, it's been a challenge, but yeah.
And initially what we could do, but when the numbers came down, we could set up so you had videos instead of a personal guide, which was great up to a point. So I did a video, and Gary did a video, and Elliot did a video in the warehouse, and it was good, and people seemed to like it. But I think everyone that actually worked here got absolutely fed up. It was like on a loop tape. And God, that's Drew droning on again. But it did work. It worked well.
It did.
For the time we could do it. But then it got to the point I thought, you know, it's just not good. The great thing was in Scotland, and I'm not sure what it is in other whiskey producing places that have had the similar problems, but whiskey production in Scotland is an essential industry. If I'm being cynical, it's an essential industry because it generates so much money for the taxman, which is fair enough. But we we had a short stoppage, and it wasn't to do with, you know, all the guys in the team came in and worked very safely, and we could have kept, if this happened a few years in the future and we had all the warehousing on site, we could have just carried on. But we had problems, you know, when a warehouse is full, you have to apply for all the red tape and all sorts of things that people watching this will probably understand. So we stopped for a short while, but we resumed production quite a long time back. And yeah, you know, so this end of the building where we're sitting 20 feet away has been just going along merrily. You know, otherwise we would have, and there will be a thing, I suppose, 10 years down the line, there'll be a little hiccup in lots of distilleries programs from what did you do in that year. But anyway, so yeah, we're back in the game. Stills are humming away. I can hear I would hear the switches if the door was open. So yeah, it's great to be started again.
And obviously, the Scottish government needs that tax revenue, but there's also been talk of shutting down industrial production too, if COVID doesn't get any better, and that would shut you down, right?
I was reading that today. I remain to be, you know, I could be proved wrong. I would be very surprised if they stop whiskey, because it contributes so much to the coffers. I always joke about it because, of course, we're only here because of the tax records of 1494 and the duty paid on 8 bolls of malt. So I can't sit here and whine about the tax man. Well, although I do off camera. But we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that little thing in the Exchequer Rolls of 1494, which was a tax man getting his little cut. So yeah, we do what we're meant to do and we pay our dues, but
Gary, I forgot to ask you, what is in your glass tonight? What are you sipping on?
Me, I've actually got a bit of, I'm very fortunate, and I shouldn't be telling Drew this, but I can go into the warehouse at any time and take whatever I want. No, that's not true. I've got some of Cask-Strength. I hide the tools from Drew so he can't get into them. I've actually got a Glenfarclas 15-year-old, which is, most people that know me, it's one of my favourite drams, if not at this moment in time my favourite dram. I'm sure that will change very, very shortly.
And I never did point out what I'm drinking. I have the Oban Distillers edition from last year, the 2019 release of that.
Yeah.
Just arrived today, so time to pour just a little bit more of that one.
That's a big favorite of all.
What do you expect the single malt from Lindores Abbey? Give us an idea of what it's going to taste like when you do get it into a bottle, and what we can sort of compare it to, or can we compare it to anything else in Scotland?
Mark, that's really interesting. I can see Drew smirking already, because it was a question that Drew asked me during the week. He was like, look, you're going to have to tell me where you think this whiskey's heading towards. And it really got me racking my brains, and I confirmed with some of my other colleagues as well. It's from the sample that we trialled on, so cask number 1 from 2017, which was the first ever cask filled at Lindores. That was the dram that we tried on the 20th of December. And that cask had never been opened since the day it was filled. It had never been opened, so nobody really knew what to expect. And we discovered that it's very sweet, and maybe it's just me being a little bit humble, but I was very pleasantly surprised by actually how good the whiskey was. Now, we know that the whiskey or the spirit has evolved from that time, but there's a sweetness to it, the caramel, the butterscotch, the fruitiness is still there again, but there's this malty and oily aftertaste. It's more in the Speyside style, I would say, but that doesn't come as a surprise. You know, when I look at the setup, what we've got in my background, and Andy Cant, who was obviously one of our consultants as well, we're, you know, born and brought up in Speyside, so probably some of that's rubbed off on us. But I know how we can make different styles, but we're super chuffed with the spirit style we've got. Looking at it, you know, to me, I'm getting sort of Clynelish kind of vibes coming from it, which is just, you know, an awesome dram, Clynelish. And there's a bit of Inchgower, some Linkwood, maybe a little bit of smokiness coming through. So Old Pulteney sort of walks in there as well. It's every year it's going to change until it eventually gets to an age where you go, yeah, that's it. But I do see it as a Speyside style, definitely.
I have a question for Drew and Helen from Graham Fraser. They want to know if you're sitting in the Lowland or the Highland side of the distillery. Because I know the border runs right through the Abbey, right?
Yeah, well, not quite through the Abbey, but it runs through when the Highland Lowland, and it's funny that Lindores is the gift that keeps on giving in these kind of things. So the first, to the best of my knowledge, the first Highland Lowland line that was written by a sort of clerk in an office somewhere, who knows where, and it was from Dundee down to, down on the west coast. Now the town is not Greenock, it's down that way. But anyway, where it is, if you get your ruler from when you're at school, your see-through ruler from your geometry set at school, and you do it from, it's not Gourock. Anyway, wherever it is, it comes right through to Dundee. And we own the land down to the low water mark on the Tay. Right, the farm has always gone down to the low water mark on the Tay, which is about, from where I'm sitting, across about 3 fields, it's about a quarter of a mile. The line, when it gets to, it's Dunoon to Dundee, and it crosses right in front of here. So arguably, we're right on the line, but legally, we're lowland, because, which means we are, I don't know, about 10 metres into the Highlands, quarter of a mile into the lowlands. So we're technically a lowland distillery. And I always like this thing, but it's not kind of wee gimmick or anything like that. It's just, that's the way it was. It's just, that's the lay of the land, as they say. So
you'll have to call it a lowland whiskey then, right?
Yeah, we're categorized as lowland, but obviously the funny thing with whiskey is we're further north than Tullybarden, for instance. So yeah, it's a weird thing. As I say, it was just an arbitrary line for tax reasons, as all your watchers will know. But it is a kind of funny thing, because you'd think Highlands are higher up, further north than lowlands, but it's not the case. And I know there's been discussion over the years about changing these things, but it's a label. So we will label ourselves as a lowland distillery.
And to answer your chap's question, we're sitting in the lowland side at the moment.
Actually, yeah, we are. Yeah. If we were sitting in the Highland side, if it's high tide, the Tay would be about there over our heads.
Now, Tom Fredericks has a good question for you, since you're sitting in the place where whiskey originated, the oldest ever recorded mention of Scotch whiskey that lives to this day from 1494. How much pressure is there for you to uphold the heritage when the Lindores Abbey whiskey finally hits the market?
That's
a great deal of pressure, and I know Gary feels that as well. This journey started a long time ago, and one of the things that was an option in a funny way was, hey, what a great story! Make it a Disneyland for whiskey. You've got we have William Wallace, we have all these different things. You could just always rely on the history and forget the spirit. My belief from day one was, if you're going to build a whiskey distillery, it lives or dies by the whiskey. So there is a pressure, and a promise I made with Jim Swan, 15 odd years ago, and lots of people I met along the way, was that there was that shoulder that only happened by luck, if you like. My grandfather bought the farm in 1913. We had no idea of any whiskey links or anything like that. And then 20 years ago, we suddenly find we do have this weight of pressure. But you've got to enjoy a challenge. But I suppose it was Jim Swan in discussion one day was saying that you've got to remember that in whiskey tastings, wherever they are, whether in America or London or Fife, they're blind tastings. So it doesn't, he was kind of joking in a way, but Friar John Cor could be sitting in the corner of the room, and that makes no difference. The spirit from Lindores has to stand up. And it was a huge moment for myself and Gary and the whole team when not that long ago, the new make won Best New Make in Scotland. So we'd really like to think we're heading in the right direction. We'd like to think we're respecting the past, but in a way, when the whiskey comes out we'll always have the past. We'll always have Friar John Cor and all the history, and we embrace that. We want to really, share that with everyone. But if we want it to survive and thrive as a whiskey brand, what we sell to the public's got to be good, because if it isn't, then it's just like it's a gimmick, and we're very, very far away from being a gimmick.
And Tom Frederick says, great explanation. Thank you for that. And I have a feeling we're going to start a little controversy. So I'm going to address this next question to Gary.
Oh, you don't need to.
Because when you see who posted it, you'll figure this out really.
All right, okay.
From G. McKenzie, which still produces better spirit, Pops or G? And Pop refers to Poppy, your other daughter. So...
Oh, Gary.
I should point out it's G's birthday today.
Tomorrow.
Oh, thanks for that, Drew. I appreciate that. No, it's definitely G.
One of these days.
I think it's time to be honest and truthful, and this could be career limiting. No, what's really interesting is they both produce fantastic spirit, but they both produce two slightly different styles, Mark. But even though they were built as identical stills, they get charged at the same time, they get the same steam, they do produce two slightly different spirits. We hadn't really picked up on it, and it wasn't until we got one of the first visits from Richard Patterson of Dalmore fame, White Mackay, and he picked up on the different style in the spirits, and I hadn't really noticed it before, but it wasn't until he started, coming out with some of the nosing he was getting from it that I realised, Jay, you're absolutely right. There is two different styles of spirit here. So Poppy tends to be more, shall we say, spicy, in your face, come and have me. Whereas G is she's more mellower. She's easier on the nose, easier to taste. But when you bring the two of them together like both sisters, they make a great combination.
And Tim Foster is weighing in here with not Pops or G. The answer, it's Dodo. Which one is Dodo?
Oh, that's really an interesting story as well. So Dodo is our wash still. So Dodo is named after Dorothy, who was Drew's mum. And to be honest with you, when Dodo comes in at the start of the spirit run, she has one of the most fantastic noses you can imagine. It's just tropical fruits. It's pineapple, coconut, mango, you name it, it's there. And sorry to disappoint Pops and G, but if you ask me to go one of the safes to know which was coming in the nicest, it's definitely Dodo every time.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Nice politically correct answer there, Gary. They'll let you live after this one.
I should add that Helen did have the chance to have a still named after her, but no. Anyway,
didn't want to be immortalised in copper. I think you're right with that, Helen.
Yeah.
My kinsman wants to know where the barley for your distillery is malted. I'm assuming you're using a commercial maltings, obviously, but which maltings are you using, and where does the barley come from?
I don't know if that's a leading question from Mr. Kinsman, because I'm thinking it's maybe Mr. Kinsman of Baird's Malt.
Yes, so,
we're getting a bunch of leading questions.
Oh, what? They're good today. So, from day one, all our malt has been malted by Muntins. So, in year one, it started off with Fife barley. So, all the barley was collated in Fife and then malted by Muntins and then returned to ourselves. Luckily, we have two very local farmers who, one of the farmers is actually, if I'm not correct, Drew, please correct me, is Drew's cousin Roger. And we have another farmer called Richard Black from the Bray of Lindores. Now, originally when the monks were at the Abbey, they had stewardship of the land within 4 miles of the Abbey. And these two farms still sit within that 4-mile radius. So we like to think of it as local barley. It's still under the, it's been growing in the fields. I was right, it is Mr. Kinsman of Baird's Malt fame. Mark, I hope you're enjoying your retirement. I know it's well overdue.
Well overdue for him or for the rest of the industry?
Oh, I don't know. I know he's enjoying himself. So yes, we're using local barley to become local malt, and for us, it's a fantastic story. And I don't like using the word terroir, but I do like using the word provenance. And you could tell a difference when we moved on to the local barley, and that's barley that's been grown in fields that you can see from the distillery. There was a distinct change, especially when we first started mashing in. There was this sweetness. It felt like it was at home. It's hard to describe. It was like a senses thing, but it was really you could tell there was something different in the malt.
We have a good question from Mark Seagetz here, and we addressed this at the start, but he would like to know, and he may have joined us a couple of minutes late, some information on the time frame of the first bottling for the 1494 members, maybe also for the first public release, and he also wants to know about the cask composition of the bottlings. A lot of information there, and I'm not 100% sure you're ready to talk about it, but what can you tell us?
Drew, if you want to take the first two, I'll take the last one.
Yeah, I could. The membership bottle, the 1494 membership bottling, we are narrowing down the choice of casks that go into it. We have the design of the bottle. It's all ready on paper. It's ready to go. We would hope that our 1494 members will get it in it's about mid-March. We think if we waited 526 years, a couple of months, because it's like everything we do, we want it to be right. We don't want to rush it out and say, right, it's going to be there on the 1st of January and it not being right. So yeah, 1494, all things being equal, with all the extra pressure that is global at the moment, but I think that will happen. Our first release to the public at a normal price, and that's kind of one thing I always want to get across. When we do our public launch, we're hoping for June. You know what? With the way the world is, we don't want to tie ourselves to a date, because if we do, we'll be held to it. And I can understand why we'll be held to it, but just at the moment, who knows what's around the corner? It's a pretty grim situation at the moment. But we let's hope it's still June. We've been doing a lot of tasting along the way, and we're narrowing it down. And I've said all along as well, I was talking about other things earlier, but we don't want to release it till we think it's right. And obviously Gary's integral in that. We don't want to say we're just rushing it out because we need the money or anything like that. It's important, the finances, but I would much rather go begging to the bank, make sure it's right, and keep everyone happy. So that's the plan. So that could be mid-June. The makeup of it is more Gary's department.
Go ahead, Gary.
So just to lead on from Drew, so since we came back after lockdown, probably July last year, we started doing lots of different tastings of the different casks. Now we've always got three main casks at Lindores, and that's American Standard barrels, bourbon barrels from either the Old Forester or Woodford Reserve, Brown and Foreman. We have Oloroso sherry butts from Miguel Martins, and lastly, as Drew talked about earlier, we have got the STR wine barrique, which is the unique recipe to Lindores, which was put together by both Dr. Jim Swan and Miguel Martin. So we looked at other different casks that we had sitting in the warehouse and tried to see if we could integrate them and bring them in and see how that was working. But as we look at it and as we keep looking at the data and everyone's notes, we realised that the best first release is going to be a combination of these three casks. Now, what amazes me sometimes, in fact, it doesn't, not sometimes, is the fact that Dr. Jim Swan had a vision of where he thought the spirit was going to go. Now, he had no idea how the spirit was going to nose and taste when it came off the stills. He had an idea of where he thought it would be, but he wasn't, unfortunately, ever physically able to nose and taste the spirit. So I've kind of had to pick up his mantle and go, right, what would Dr. Jim be trying to do with this? Now, I think the spirit's probably a little bit different from what he was expecting, but I would like to think he'd be more than happy with it. So at this moment in time, there was a blend of the three casks. And when I was at Cornwall at the Wonderful World of Whisky show in 2019, I can't believe that's almost 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I actually tell everyone, Mark, anyone that will listen to me, how magical a weekend that is. It's just a fantastic event. It really was. I was welcomed from the first minute that I arrived there to the minute I left. It was just a fabulous experience. And it'll probably be a hard fight for me just to go there on my own the next time. I think there'll be a few other people wanting to come with me. Anyway, I digress slightly. So it's going to be a combination of these three casks. I'm not going to give you away too much of the ratios, but it will be more bourbon driven. And if I'm being honest, our spirit sits very well in a bourbon cask. But what we are finding very pleasantly is it doesn't matter what cask we put our spirit into, it just seems to work. And we're very fortunate and very lucky with that. The only thing is, I see on my shift at this moment in time, we will not be filling into tequila or mezcal. That just won't be happening. Not in my shift, unless the boss tells me that's what's happening.
No, it's not going to happen.
And unfortunately, it is safe to say that the Wonderful World of Whiskey show in Cornwall, Ontario, will not be taking place this year because of COVID. The NAV Center in Cornwall, where that event is held, is actually a government training facility for air traffic controllers and was actually used as a quarantine facility early on during the pandemic. And they've been told to not expect to be able to have public events through most of this year. And there is some serious doubt as to whether that event will actually return at all ever in the future.
That's
but
a real
it won't
shame.
happen until at least 2022, which is a shame.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Jim Swan, though, because if I remember correctly, you guys have a photo of Jim hanging in the still house. And I think you may be one of the few clients of Jim's that have done that hung a picture of him in the still house.
Yeah.
Explain how the whole connection with Jim came about years ago.
Well, as you know, Mark, this project has been, as I say, at least 20 years of me banging on doors and speaking to people. And Jim, back even 20 years ago, Jim, there was only a few people in the industry who were the go-to people if you were going to set up a new distillery, and Jim was one of probably 3 people. So I first met Jim at least over 20 years ago, and he was really a great guy, because at the time when he came to Lindores, it was a falling down farm. So he probably thought, God, here's another guy that's, with all the best intentions, it's a nice story, but it's not going to happen. But we stayed in touch along the way, and he was always happy to chat and things like that. And then eventually, when things started becoming a wee bit more serious, and said, well, let's change it from just a friendly chat to you could argue, a paid-for consultancy. So then, that's when the project started. And he was a hugely influential guy in the industry, but also, in our case, for us. And so then we when things started really happening, he was the guy who helped, as Gary said, introduced me to the guys who could supply us with casks, went up to Forsyths, because it was one of the promises I made to him, that we wouldn't, like I mentioned earlier about the history and the whiskey. The whiskey is hugely important, so we weren't going to shortchange the whiskey side of it. We had all the history, that's great, but we could have got stills from all over the place. We could have cut corners. And the one little side story to that is I'm delighted I said that, because at one point there was a hiccup in that. So we'd had the meetings with Forsyths. We were going to have one wash still, one spirit still, and that was all good. It was going to cost an arm and a leg. But we did that. But I'd made him the promise we would spend whatever we'd spend. And then one day he came back from another distillery. It was actually Annandale. Yeah. And he said, Drew, do you remember the sort of promise you made me about, you dig deep in your pockets and see if you find any loose change down the back of the sofa? And he kept sort of saying how good the spirit was from Annandale, or the new make was from Annandale at the time. And I said, well, that's great. And then he said, but you do remember what you said? And I said, yeah, okay, I remember what I said. So, and his theory was, and I think it's been borne out, that if we had the 2 smaller spirit stills, that more copper contact, etc., etc. So I slightly naively said, okay, well, I'll do what I can do. I've never built a distillery before. So I very naively thought, well,
You have now, though, Drew.
Yeah.
You have now.
So
Just remember that. You have now.
One big still divided two small ones should be roughly the same price. Obviously it wasn't. So yeah, but you know what? I'm delighted we did, because I think, as we were talking about earlier about Poppy and G and the difference it's made, you know, we didn't shortchange the commitment to the spirit. So that was because of Jim, and as Gary said, and I would never talk different about all the other. We're friends with all the distilleries. There's lots of distilleries we go to that were Jim Swan distilleries, and I've yet to go to one that I don't think the spirit's great. But I suppose what in a tiny way differentiates us is tragically, as you know, Jim died. It was our topping out ceremony, and Jim was due here. I had a call from Richard Forsyth saying tragically Jim had passed away. And we 13th of February. So we carried not with any ceremony, but we do a thing here which our members know about and our cask owners know about. We set fire. We've got a 300-meter high bear on the hill behind us, and we set fire to it. I say it's carved into the field. And anyway, we set fire to it. So that day we set fire to it for Jim and his memory, and it was really nice. And we're great friends with the family. But to the point is what Gary then had to do was pick up the ball and run from there, because as he said just now, that tragically Jim wasn't here to kind of see his vision come to reality. And as everyone who has created a distillery will know, you can have all with the best plans in the world, it's not going to pan out the way you want. I mean, I said to Jim at the very beginning, one of my favorite whiskeys is Mortlach, and I said, can we make our spirit like Mortlach? And he looked at me like I was a complete idiot, which I now understand why. And he said, "Well, no, you can push it in a direction, but you can't just make it like something else." So Gary had the kind of
trust me, you would have needed a lot more than 3 stills to pull that one.
well, exactly. So Gary had the kind of blueprint, the kind of here's the distillery, here's the theory behind it, but how's it going to actually work? And so I think we've been the huge beneficiaries of Jim's wisdom, and then the beneficiary of Gary and Andy Cant, who we mentioned earlier on, to take Jim's vision to what we are now, which, as Gary also just said, is probably a few stages away from the original vision. But that's the world of whiskey, isn't it? That's the way it works.
Gary, I know that in talking with Ian Chang, who worked with Jim at Kavalan and is now working on this new Kuroizawa Distillers project in Japan, he had the benefit of having Jim's notes. Did Jim leave any notes or anything for you to work with?
Drew can tell you on one hand how much notes Jim left for us.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
A lot was I suppose way worked. It'd be an interesting one day to sit down and have a dram with the Jim Swan sort of fraternity, because I like to think that would have happened. A lot of it was in Jim's head. I have 400,000 emails. I have a few bits and bobs, but no, is the honest answer, because I suppose we hadn't got to that. When we started the official consultancy, he was very honest. The way it worked was, he won't be around that much when the build is going on, apart from you go and see for size, you do this, that, and the other. When we fire the stills up, Jim would then be very much involved again. And of course, that's the one part of the process that tragically didn't happen. But I suppose to go back to the original question, was the reason we have what we have in the still house is we were very flattered that Richard Patterson, who we were talking about earlier, he was asked to make the eulogy at Jim's memorial, and he, between himself and Jim's family, etc., they thought, well, the fitting place. So there was 2 posters at the memorial that everyone that was there signed, and the family, and it's really touching, genuinely very touching, that they thought, well, the best place for them to be would be at Lindores in the Stillhouse. So it sounds corny when I say this, but I do mean it. I think his spirit lives on at Lindores. And we have this 1494 society, and Jim is honorary member 1495. So it's a nice thing. All his distilleries have huge connections to Jim. We're not trying to kind of leapfrog any of that, but we are where we are, and Gary is doing a fantastic job of taking that mantle and the blueprint to what Lindores will be, in 2021. When it hits the market, it hits the outside world. That's when reality, that's when Friar John Cor, William Wallace, etc., slightly fade into the background, because people sitting in a bar in Tokyo, New Jersey, wherever, will taste it and judge us by the spirit.
Yeah.
But if
We
this
have
is
a question from Klaus Dobelman in Austria. Speaking of Jim, are you still using the heated portion of the warehouse? And are there any differences that are noticeable in regards to the whiskey? I know that Jim liked to experiment with heated warehouses at times.
You
take this one, Drew.
Yeah. I was just saying how great Jim, he's a legend. He's all sorts of things, and still is. I suppose, again, I go back to I've never built a whiskey distillery, etc., etc. And Jim did, his huge success was Cavalan, amongst many, but Cavalan was probably, you could argue, top of the pyramid. They have a different climate. We wanted part of it, very big part of his remit, as I'm sure it was with every other distillery he ever worked for, was, we really want a spirit that will mature quickly. So you could argue a way of making it mature quickly is putting it in a heated warehouse. And I suppose he kind of played into my thinking, a distillery has a lot of heat to get rid of. Why not use it to heat a heated part of the warehouse? So I went along with the idea up to a point, and then I've had 20, luckily I knew lots of other people in the distillery who said, look, hang on a minute, it's a great idea, but are you really going to put your whole first year's production into an experiment? So we kind of made the heated warehouse into the back bit of the warehouse, as Klaus saw. So we got that far, and at some cost, and then tragically Jim died, and we kept humming and hawing about it. And then also, if I'm honest, the Scotch Whisky Association never said you can't do that, but you can't. There's all sorts of rules and regs. So to cut a long story short, we could have either had the biggest sauna in the whole of Fife. Eventually, literally this month, we had to rip the whole thing out. We sold all the, we didn't sell it. We gave the radiators away that had never been switched on. The wood has been reused. We've now got a bottling hall instead of a heated warehouse. I think the big boys, we'll leave that kind of experimentation to the big boys. Maybe one day we'll heat a couple of casks or something like that. But I think we've got our own little experiments in the future, and we'll do what we can do. But that was arguably I was going to say the biggest mistake that didn't happen. But it was an expensive mistake. But you live and learn, don't you?
Well, it works because we know it. Brown Foreman has been doing it for years at Woodford Reserve and its distillery in Louisville. They've been using heated warehouses using the steam from the distillery.
Yeah.
And the heat from the distillery to heat those warehouses during the winter for many, many years. But it requires big, thick stone warehouses. You have to have a lot of insulation to make it work. It doesn't work with your standard Kentucky style rick houses or even the dunnage style warehouses without insulation.
And I think I'm not sure what the rules are over in. We had great pleasure of being over in Louisville when we first went to meet our cask suppliers, etc. So I'm not quite sure what the rules and regs are. But the thing that eventually really killed it, if I'm honest, was if we had to heat it to a certain temperature, we then, by law and health and safety and all sorts of things, would have to ventilate it. So all I could see was all these pound signs just. And if I'm honest, the thing, one of the reasons Scotch whisky is the global leader is because Scotland weather is
cracking climate for
Yeah,
making whiskey.
I'm looking at a freezing cold Lindores Abbey, frost on the ground. It'll get quite warm in the summer. It'll be wet most of the time. And that's what we do. We don't do Taiwanese climates. So you live and you learn.
And frankly, the spirit that Gary is now making is so fab. We're kind of glad we didn't.
I think I was, I'll take it on the chin. I thought it was a great thing to be doing different things, etc. And it took a little bit of wisdom from other very wise people in the industry to say, look, just leave things like that to either to the big boys or to Lindores in 20 years' time. Then you can mess around with things like that. For now, we just plow our own furrow, do things the traditional way, and do it well.
We have a question for Graham Fraser. He wants to know, Gary, about your whiskey background. Where were you before Lindores, and how did you get into the whiskey business?
Well, I've actually only ever worked in two industries in Scotland. One is the whiskey industry, another one is oil and gas. Probably Scotland's two biggest industries. So since I started off as an apprentice with actually Dewars of Perth in Bramond, working in the bottling hall there. I was with United Distillers Diageo for almost 20 years. My last couple of years with Diageo were up in Speyside running Cragganmore Distillery. It reminded me that it's the 10th anniversary from when we had the very bad winter and snowfall. And I was up, that was my first year up in Cragganmore as a distillery manager, and it was a baptism of fire. It really was. There was 2 feet of snow outside. It was -10. It was just, wow, this is, I was driving home in a big Land Rover Defender every night just in case I got called. It wasn't fun, but I say it wasn't fun. It actually was. I just absolutely loved up in Speyside and loved the job. But unfortunately, things just didn't quite turn out. But I have a background in electrical engineering, and the oil and gas industry at that time was booming. So I decided that, something, I'm going to go back to that and just take a little bit of a break from the whiskey industry. But as anyone knows that's left the whiskey industry, there's this huge magnetic pull that you just can't get rid of it. And interestingly, when I had my last day up at Cragganmore, a good friend of mine, Peter Campbell, who has run a lot of fantastic distilleries in Scotland, he said to me, he says, "You'll be back, Gary." He says, "I can see it in you." He says, "This is what you want to do. You'll be back." And I was like, "Nah, I just can't see it, Peter." But, 3-4 years later, I was like, something I could do with this again. And it was actually a colleague that I worked beside in oil and gas that had sent me a news clipping, and it was the local paper, the Courier, saying that a distillery was getting opened again in Lindores. And I just simply put it to the side. And a few months later, it was Helen. I think it was maybe on Facebook or something like that. She was looking for an office administrator, and I sent Helen just a simple letter saying, I'm not very good with a typewriter, but here's my CV, here's some of my past history, and if you are considering looking for a distillery manager, I'd be really interested in it. And we had some more communication backwards and forwards, and eventually Helen and Drew asked me through for a conversation, I think we called it, but that conversation, I think, was almost 3 or 4 hours long, and everything, as soon as I arrived there, everything just felt right for me, and I came home and told Caroline that, I want to come out of the oil and gas industry, I want to go and work at Lindores. And as Helen said, I think one of my first visits was, unfortunately, the day after Jim had Swan had died, and I got to meet Helen and Drew and some other people, and eventually I was very fortunate that both Drew and Helen offered me the position as a distillery manager, and something I've not forgotten and very much enjoy. And it's just been a fantastic journey. We've had highs and lows, but it's just been amazing. It really has. And I know there's some good times coming forward as well.
Given the way the oil and gas prices have plummeted
well, yeah,
years, I think you made the right call.
I think so too. Yes, definitely.
Let's see. Tabitha, Spirit Bomb, it's been that kind of week, so I've just poured myself a large dram of 10-year-old Octomore. I love that one. Andrew Wedge, the guy who sold me my sauna, said a whiskey in there would be perfect at the end of the day. Instead, I ended up finishing up the whole bottle with a friend. Hope that sauna was at home, Andrew. Got to be responsible. No driving after this. Tabitha, the whiskey sweat's something I'd rather not experience again. Okay. We know about the history at Lindores Abbey, but I remember a couple of years ago, you guys did some archaeological work that uncovered even more of it than you'd thought, right?
Yeah, it was. It's been an amazing thing. So when we had to build the distillery, we built it on our old farmsteading. This farmsteading's been here for 200 or 300 years. We had to do an archaeological dig because we're obviously right next to Lindores Abbey. And I was very confident, slightly blasé, that we wouldn't find anything. We families owned it for over 100 years. There's nothing there. So we started doing the dig with obviously an archaeologist overseeing it. And on about day 2, we found some walls of the abbey, and we thought, wow, this is, it's exciting. It was very exciting to the point we're finding too many walls, and we thought we need to build our distillery. So anyway, that was all fine. And then the last part of that element of it is, if you're building a big building over in the UK, you have to do what's called a suds pond, and it's a building thing. It's nothing glamorous at all. It's where the overflow water goes. And because I had this grid of where all these walls were, I said, well, let's just chuck it in there. Just get the digger in, do it. We'll walk away. That's fine. So we started doing that, and Rebecca, the archaeologist, came knocking on the door, all excited again because they were finding stuff. And she said, "Oh, we found this thing." We came across it. It looked like the top of a well. It was a circle of abbey stone, and they're very recognized as red sandstone, full of water. And we thought, well, that's amazing. And we found a well from medieval times. And then we took the water out, and it's a clay bowl. And the lead archaeologist, because it was a big deal, Rebecca got her guys in. And they took it out, and it was clay. And the guy turned around and said, God, this looks like the base of a still. And it was like, wow, a well is a big deal. The base of a still is obviously a bigger deal given where we're at. So it's huge excitement, but there was always in the back of my mind, thought, God, that's great. But how do you prove to the outside world it is what we think it is? So that we then commissioned the scientific things. So you take the clay, and they do whatever the boffins do, and they find there's carbon, because if it had no carbon in it, then it's not the base of a still. So it has carbon, it has grains of barley. So we got to this situation. We've unearthed this, arguably, you could argue it's like the holy grail of whiskey in a sense, to find that here. The slight problem is that if you find something from arguably the 12th, 13th century, there's not a guy behind you with a copy of the day's paper saying, this is what it is. So we've done as much as we can, and to our mind, and we've had lots of other people looking at it, this is the base of a still dating back to, the Abbey was founded in 1191. It's probably a bit more recent than that. So ties in more with 14th century, 13th century. Then what weighed on my mind, so unwittingly, we've kind of uncovered this massive thing. And I'd bring, when journalists were coming, and we're very privileged, we've got guys coming from Japan, and I suppose I'm slightly blasé, because I've grown up here, I don't get to a certain extent how big a deal it is. And I'm showing some guys from Japan especially, and I thought they were about to sort of throw themselves into the well or into the still thing. It was so sort of dramatic. However, I said earlier, we set up the Preservation Society. So I was really conscious that here's me banging on, we're preserving the spiritual home of Scotch whisky, and arguably all we've done is taken the soil off it, and we're not preserving it. So it's, as we sit here now, and it's 50 feet to my right, it's been undercover for the last year or so, because we did show it to people, and I think, we thought, hang on a minute, this is too important just to be traipsing around. So it's undercover at the moment. One of the big projects for 2021 is to open it up. But to do that, as you can imagine, it's going to be an expensive operation. We have to work out how we can make it so people can see it, visit it, without harming it. So you need, there's firms that do these things, but what's quite nice is when we're saying to people who have joined the Preservation Society, well, this is where your money's going. This is what your contributions are paying for. So 2021, as it's not got off to the best start, but let's hope there's things in the future that will raise all of our spirits.
And Chris Ratcliffe wants to know, just this is an example of how difficult it really is to build a modern distillery on a site that is so historic and so has so much importance to Scotland's history. I would imagine you've got archaeologists and historic preservation people watching every move you make on that farm.
We did. We've got we had a great, well, we still do have a great relationship. Because what doesn't happen often, sadly, nowadays, is that private enterprise teams up with preservation. You could argue that there's bigger companies that would kind of slightly railroad through all that, but because this is my home, I suppose I can imagine, the investors and the banks are probably thinking, look, God, there's easier ways of doing this, because the where we're sitting now, which is obviously in the distillery, we're the other side of the road from the Abbey, and this side wasn't listed. So in theory, which is crazy to think about now, in theory, we could have bulldozed all this and just rebuilt a sort of glass structure. But, I wasn't about to let that happen. And fun enough, when the project very first started, as I've said before, 20 plus years ago, and I put the idea of building something here out to the whiskey world, and I would get emails from America and Canada and all sorts of places saying they couldn't understand. No one was ever aggressive about it. They just couldn't get their heads around why you have a property that is so important, but it was just a rundown farm. When we had it, it was just a rundown farm. I've had the privilege of being to Mount Vernon twice. And and Steve Bashaw, who you'll probably know, etc. And to go there, you can see what can happen if you get the will of the. Well, I remember him saying, it's the will of it was the ladies of Washington, I think, at the time, and one of them was a Mrs. Mars. So I think the money wasn't quite so hard to find, but good on them. They resurrect, from finding some wood under the ground, they now have a great replica working distillery at Mount Vernon. And when I was first talking to Steve and the people at Mount Vernon, they were saying, why don't you recreate what Friar John Cor did? And I was kind of trying to explain that, but that was, 1494, and it needs to be a living, breathing distillery. We can't just have a little stone, tiny little still. So, it kind of takes me back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that history is so important to us, and we get gifts like this original still. It's for us and the team to then take that forward, and that would fall if the whiskey isn't great.
Yeah.
And I think, certainly from what I'm drinking tonight, I'm 100% confident the whiskey will be great.
Well, I know that Steve usually watches these webcasts, so he may very well be watching right now. Whiskey Canuck is late joining, but he remembers Gary at the Cornwall Festival and trying the new make in the Aqua Vitae, and he'll be watching later. But are you still making the Aqua Vitae and selling it?
Yeah, the Aqua Vitae, it's really important for me that almost every new distillery in Scotland does a gin. And the question I was asked more than anything when I was trying to get this thing off the road was, you will be, in fact, sometimes it wasn't a question, it was a statement, you will be doing a gin. And at first I thought, yeah, God. But it's not part of, if the first spirit that came from Lindores was a gin that's possibly arrived in a tanker behind the building, we've chucked a couple of herbs into it, that's not what we do. My bank manager might be sitting there saying, well, actually, what he should have done, because the gin industry's gone way up there. But I love the fact we did the Aqua Vitae, and it's growing, and we love it. And I think when we release our whiskey, when we're a bona fide whiskey, we're in the game with the rest of the whiskey producers, we can hold our heads up because we stuck to our provenance. If I would be sitting here all day saying, well, yeah, we brought out a gin, it was just to make some money along the way. That's not what we're about.
The monks didn't make gin.
Yeah, And actually, to give Jim Swan his due, it's easy, I suppose, for a consultant to say it because there's financial pressures. But Jim was a purist, and I respect him for that. He couldn't understand why any whiskey distillery would be bringing out a gin. But your investors may have a different opinion on that. But we couldn't do that. And also, I had 20 years of saying I'm not bringing out a gin, so I'd look a bit daft if we then did.
So what else were the monks making back then? Chris Ratcliffe was wanting to know about this earlier as well. What kind of whiskey, or do we know what the monks were making, what Friar John Cor was making back then? And what else would they have been making back at the Abbey when it was still active?
They may have been. We don't. We can only sort of go on what the history books tell us, if you like. We would assume they were making mead. We know they had bees. We know they had honey. And the aquavitae. And I'm always upfront about this. I think it would be firewater. When aquavitae was first produced, and it was prior to Lindores Abbey. It came from Europe. There was other monasteries doing this thing. It was, I personally think it was medicinal. You're rubbing it like rubbing alcohol. Then we're in Fife, we're in Scotland. My theory, now I can never prove this one. You get five guys in a room, be they monks or not, and someone at some point say, well, let's try drinking this. And then his more enlightened friend would say, look, if we're going to drink it, let's try and make it taste nice. And so they start, and that is my personal opinion. And but I don't think it's a million miles away from where it wasn't matured. It didn't go into wood. It was never matured. It wouldn't have, so it would never have been whiskey.
So
it was new make spirit infused with what can we do to make it nice. And with the aquavitae, I suppose that's exactly the process we went through. We use the plants that grow in the Abbey, but Helen and I went through a depressing sort of 6 months with experimenting. We were working with Harriet Watt, who are fantastic. The Institute of Brewing.
Did you not about just lose your sight?
But they were scientists, if you like. They were students working on the science, and they were creating what we'd asked them to create. So we still have a great relationship with Harriet Watt, an ongoing relationship, and all sorts of stuff going on in the background. But they were producing a spirit just made up of these herbs, and we would go through every few weeks. And God, it was
super excited.
Yeah, it was a struggle.
Yeah.
But the game changer, well, there's two game changers. First, we were using neutral spirit. And we thought, well, this is wrong. We should use barley spirit. So that was a biggie. And then we thought, well, it's great giving it to students and scientists, but actually you need to give it to the bar world. They're the conduit to the people that are going to drink it. So we started working with some sort of cool bartenders, if you like, in Edinburgh. And saying, well, look, here's the ingredients. Let's see what we can do. And the game changer for us was they needed to make it a little bit sweeter, but the rule was we're not using anything artificial. So to make it sweeter, dates and raisins were introduced, which is great because it sticks with the provenance. The monks traded with Flanders, so they had access to dates and raisins. That just gave it that little sweetness. We weren't making a liqueur. We weren't making drambuie. I don't mind drambuie, etc. So yeah, well, you did exactly. But that was a game changer, is introducing the bar world to it. And the other thing we didn't know at the time was, will it be drunk as a neat spirit, a bit like an early whiskey? Which actually, if I'm honest, I thought that's probably the way it was going. But it turned out, because of the bar world, it ended up being more as a base for cocktails. Scandinavia, they still like it as a neat spirit with smoked fish, smoked meat. But the way it's taken off is as cocktails, and actually a bit like gin and tonic, is the aquavitae with ginger ale,
a bit of orange
and ice, and it's super. And that's the way it's happened. And it was never meant to be a fill-in. It was never meant to be the gap between what do we do to fill in the years before we have whiskey. It'll certainly continue. We will start messing around. Once the whiskey comes, we can start playing with the aquavitae and making fruit, but genuine fruit. We have orchards here, so it's not 2 drops of plum essence. It will be plums grown at Lindores and things like that. So it'll have a life of its own, and I would take it personally if we dumped it.
Yeah.
I've got a garage full of it, so I'll have to get through.
Any final thoughts? We've wasted a little over an hour of everybody's time tonight.
Oh, sorry about
Any final thoughts?
Well, for me, it's a hugely important time to be on the show, in a sense, in that this is the year that we've already gone from, we've hit our 3 years and a day mark, so we're now a grown-up distillery. It's now the chance for us to, to prove that's exactly what we are. We're not a gimmick, as I said earlier. We're not all about Friar John Cor. We're about having a serious whiskey that'll hit the market at some point this year, and it'll stand or fall on the quality of the whiskey. And I would say, with Gary here online as well, that I am hugely confident that it's a banger.
Yeah.
It's great.
Me too.
And I'm biased,
Yeah.
but it's great.
You've done an amazing job, Gary.
No, as you know, it's always been a big team effort at Lindores. I just like to lead and take the people on the journey, and it's been an exciting one. For me, 2021, it's we talked earlier about the pressure mark, and there is without doubt a little bit of pressure on making sure that we have a fantastic spirit ready and worthy of the name Lindores. I think that's really, really important. We have to have a confident spirit coming from a confident distillery made by confident people, and I'm confident we've got all three.
Nicely said. Yeah.
And I kid when I say we've wasted a little over an hour of everybody's time tonight, of course. But Helen, I've got one final question for you, because I know Drew's been banging on this idea for 20 years. What was your thought when he first told you he wanted to build a distillery at the Abbey?
Oh, that's a better question than Poppy and G.
No, in all honesty, I was totally excited. We've striven, I suppose, really. It's always been Drew's dream, but I can never pretend that I wasn't always 100% behind him. I've always been 100% behind it. And I think, truth be told, Drew likes whiskey now, but I've always loved whiskey. And I work for Glenmorangie. So yeah, it was an exciting dream for me too. And I'll tell you a tiny quick little story. When I very first met Drew's father used to have this little newspaper cutting pinned up on the inside of one of the cupboards in the kitchen, and it was a picture of Drew in the Courier, which is our local newspaper, saying that Drew wanted to put Lindores Abbey on the map. But at that stage, this was 31 years ago actually, he didn't know how he was going to do that. He just wanted to put it on the map. And I was quite excited about that even at the time, and think it's a lovely idea, and the Abbey's always been very beautiful. And so when we discovered, kind of like 28 years ago, about the Lindores and the whiskey link, it was too serendipitous, really, and we are blessed that we've had that link to whiskey, and that Drew has managed to make it his mission to put Lindores on the map, and to put the town on the map, and to bring employment back to the town, and it's been a really big part of our journey, and so no, I'm hugely proud of him, and I'm hugely proud of the team for helping to do that.
Now, I did not know that you worked at Glenmorangie. What did you do there?
I ran Cadwell House for the little maison that they have. I ran Cadwell for 5 years. In all honesty, very tragically, Drew's father died when I was running Cadwell, and we had to move, or Drew had to move back for home for various reasons. To a certain extent, it's funny how things happen. It was such a lovely job, and we enjoyed working for Glenmorangie so much that we maybe have never have left. If
because I was the chef there as well.
Yeah.
Helen was my boss.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Still is, Drew. Still is.
I remember staying at, they call it Glenmorangie House now,
Yes.
but I remember staying there a number of years ago on a press trip, and that's just a beautiful place right on the Firth of Cromarty, I believe.
Yeah. Oh, it was a heavenly job, absolutely heavenly job. And we were so close to the team, and Paul Neat was my kind of like direct boss, and I had we had a cracking time.
Yeah.
We really loved it, and the kids had an idyllic time growing up there. It was just fantastic because we were out on the beach, and So it was good. Lots
Well,
to thank Glenn for.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for joining us, and Poppy and G as well, because I'm sure they're going to be fighting over which
Yeah,
still
I'm not
produces
looking forward to
better
Monday
whiskey and
at
all that.
all.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be arguing over this one. And I think it was a good idea to do the two wash stills or do the two spirit stills and the wash still, because they'd be fighting over which one was the wash still and which one was the spirit still. So thank you all for doing this. Drew and Helen McKenzie Smith and Gary Haggart, thank you guys for doing this, and best of luck with the whiskey. I can't wait to taste it. I know I tasted the New Make and the Aquavita last year, or 2019 rather, now almost 2 years ago in Cornwall, and was impressed with it. I can't wait to taste what you've come up with now that it's mature whiskey. So thanks for doing this, and I really appreciate you joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Very good, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
And let me just have a few final thoughts here. Thank you again for joining us. Coming up on the podcast this weekend, had a great discussion earlier today with Finan O'Connor. You may know him as sort of the Irish whiskey historian. He's working on his PhD right now at Trinity College in Dublin. And as part of that project, he's been going back through and finding some of the old mash bills that Irish distilleries were using back in the 1700s and 1800s. And he's working with the folks at Lowland Distillery in Ireland to recreate those mash bills and distill modern day versions of them. And they're going to be putting them before a panel of local distillers in the next few weeks to do a blind tasting of them to see just how these whiskeys tasted. And it might actually lead to some changes in the geographical indicator for Irish whiskey in terms of single pot still recipes and what's allowed, because right now they're only allowed to use up to 5% of grains other than malted barley and raw barley. And back in the day, distillers were using oats and as much as 30% oats, or even more in some cases. So we're going to be talking with Finan about that. And I got to tell you, during the entire interview, he was sampling New Make that they'd been running off the stills at like 30 and 40%. So it's an interesting interview, a fun one. I think you'll enjoy it. Join us for the podcast this weekend. Drew and Helen are laughing in the background as they hear this. Yeah, I can just imagine what tasting New Make all day, because I've tasted it once or twice, but not just sitting and going 3 or 4 times during the interview, and it was pretty fun by the end of the time there. So yeah, Gary has already left us, but thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next week on the webcast at 5:00. Still confirming our guests for next week. I think we're going to be doing a bourbon tasting with some old friends that we had on last year, but I'm waiting to hear back from them. I'll have more details for you on social media and on the podcast this weekend. Thanks again for joining us. Stay safe, everyone. Be good to each other. Wear your masks. Respect police barricades if you happen to run across them. Don't tear them down and run in trash crap. Okay, guys? Let's all be good to each other and take care. Sláinte. We'll see you next week. Good night, all.
Night, Mark.